Linked very closely to that last video I mentioned about gaining the tee. We'll assume here we've started to gain the tee, we've got traction. This video is going to look at this idea now about how we start to capitalize on that fact. And the whole point of this video is this idea of what's called a floating tee. So the tee is never a static position, it's never the actual physical shape of the tee. I think when we look at some old footage of squash players and we see them moving, a lot of the time they physically would move out the back and they would actually stand on the tee and assess from there. It was almost a passive type tee position. The game wasn't as fast and as accelerated. But you look at the modern game, this idea about a floating tee, and how I can define a floating tee, it's trying to take up an appropriate position in regard to your previous shot and in regard to your opponent's body position or the amount of strain and stress they're under. So what I'm challenging you to be here now, and again, some of these videos are brilliant to watch, and I love just watching some of the footwork positions these players get into, is this acute awareness of what's going on. I think two things you've got to pay attention to: the quality of your shot, really observing and seeing what that ball's doing, and while you're seeing that, is really capturing your opponent's body position and capturing the amount of stress and strain they're under. All too often I see players hit a great shot, I'm seeing the opponent scrambling. In my mind, I'm watching the game and crying out to the person, get that floating tee, move across to a position where you're going to limit your opponent's options now that you've gained the tee, and now this is the next step about the floating tee to start to capitalize around this middle third. You know, this idea about this passive tee, and as a coach says, get yourself on the tee. Fine in a way, but that's the starting point. The floating tee for me is super, super important. Start simply with the floating tee. I think it's all too easy to over-anticipate and over-predict and put yourself in really bad positions, but start to pick up a few very simple patterns. And for me, one of the most simple patterns, and which is a very common one, it's the slightly backhanded floated tee. It's the one where you've hit your line and length, you may be hitting about half the service box, the ball's getting through to the back, you've got time, you've gained the tee. Right, fantastic. So you've gained the tee, and for me, there's now no point standing here. You give your opponent such an out. It's like you're inviting them to go on then, play an average shot and you can get out of trouble here. So let's now start to edge across. Let's start to throw down the dice to my opponents and go, right, you've got to play about an 8 or 9 out of 10 for me not to volley that next shot, a straight ball. So the idea where I've played, I would possibly come out to here, and this is where I'd float my tee. I'd be on my toes, I'd be ready to engage my split step. I'm massively observing and acutely aware of what's going to happen there. So I think that for me is the most simple link to start. Let's get that slightly floated tee on the backhand. Let's feel like you're suffocating the game down that side. Let's feel like you're not letting your opponent come up for air, come up for oxygen. You start to volley a couple of those shots. Say they've played a 6 out of 10. Nothing amazing, but nothing that's too easy. And you push across and you get that volley and you're here, and again, push across, back in here. That now sets the landscape for what's going on. It tells your opponent going, right, you better be really good here now. And once that starts to happen, you can actually mentally scar your opponents. You can put these doubts in their mind from relatively simple positions going, boy, like if I don't hit like an 8 out of 10 now, I'm going to be volleyed. And what am I going to do off the back of that? So I think it's imperative we start to get that idea about let's float that tee. Let's start to feel like your opponent is suffocating. One last caveat that I want to mention about this floating tee. Let's not throw all those eggs in one basket. So I've done this with a few players and they floated the tee and it's almost perfect, but then someone plays a boast and they completely stitch themselves up and they're completely nowhere. Because what they've done is 95% of their mindset is going, this ball is coming straight, and they're almost waiting for the volley and there's no thought that it could change. So you watch some of these videos of Ali Farag comes to mind, how well he floats his tee, how well he dominates the backhand. But he's so mindful that that ball could be changed and whipped across to a certain area that might not be where he's looking for. And because of that fact, he's then able to spring across and possibly volley or get onto another ball relatively easily. But that's brilliant because he's forced his opponent to compromise his basic straight drive. So there's so many little subtle layers to this. It's got a lot of mental state of mind. It's got a lot of tactical nous, what's happening with this originally gaining the tee and then floating your tee. So for me, I think it's super interesting to go into that amount of detail when we talk about controlling and building pressure in this middle third, is let's get the mindset and let's get the tactics nailed first. Once that starts happening, it starts happening well, the technique and the movement starts to build from there.